All right, we're at 12:01. I think just in the interest of time, we'll get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this lunch and learn about co-living housing. This is in response to a state mandate. Before we get started, just have a few notes about how we'll handle this lunch and learn session. So please note that the chat is available. You can chat to the panelists, and the chat is for questions only, so not for comments or general discussion. We won't be collecting comments through the chat for this project. So if you do have a question, please put that in the chat so we can make sure it's addressed in the Q&A portion of this presentation. And wanted to also let folks know that we are recording today's session. The presentation, we do plan to post it to our project webpage afterwards. And knowing that we're going to have a Q&A portion at the end of the meeting, be thinking about your question. If you have a question at any point, go ahead and just type it into the chat. We'll log it and make sure we read those questions out loud and respond during that Q&A portion. And then wanted to just provide a bit of context around what we're here to talk about before passing it over to Charlie Engel, who is the project manager for this code amendment. So this project, this code update, it's really being undertaken in response to a state mandate. So the Charlie will provide a little more background around the state mandate. I also just want to highlight, and Charlie will reinforce this in her presentation as well, that we are not proposing to go beyond the minimum requirements set by the state mandate. So because of that, outreach for this project does look a little different than our typical code amendment process. Our main goal, because we're following strict compliance with state law, is to raise awareness about the upcoming code change and share information with the community, including at this event today. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our presentation. Charlie, I will pass this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I know you had mentioned that the recording will be on the project webpage, so if you could include that in the chat for everyone so they have access to that, that would be
Yes.
great. I did want to go over a little bit of an agenda for this meeting. First, we'll do an overview of what is co-living housing, how is it defined, what might it look like, and then go into a little bit of that legislative background surrounding House Bill 1998 and dive deeper into some of the state's intent. We'll then look at the geographic scope and where we are required to allow for co-living housing, specifically in Bellevue. And then that will be followed by several slides detailing the minimum bill requirements that we are mandated to comply with. We'll then take a look at the project schedule. And finally, as Nick mentioned, open it up for Q&A. Before we dive into it, I did want to go over a couple of the webinar goals. We hope to have everyone informed about the requirements in House Bill 1998 by the end of this meeting. We'll cover more details on this later in the presentation, but I wanted to reinforce that this is a state mandate and we are required to comply with the minimum standards outlined in the bill. Again, the code updates will remain in strict compliance with those minimum requirements, so we're not proposing to go above and beyond that baseline. So there's not a lot of scope for community engagement beyond providing information and education. But if you have a question during the presentation, we'll answer it during the Q&A. But if you have a concern or a comment, you can submit those certainly to me or directly to the Bellevue City Council. And I think that their email will be provided in the chat. And then my contact information will be provided later on as well. So let's get into it. What is co-living housing? This type of development has historically had many different names that you may have heard of, including co-living, congregate living, single room occupancy, rooming house, boarding house, lodging house. There's so many, that's just to name a few. But what they're defined as is individually rented and lockable rooms that include private living and sleeping space. I will continually refer to these individual rented and lockable rooms as sleeping units throughout this presentation. That comes up later when I start talking about the development standards. So just know when I say sleeping unit, I'm talking about what you would typically imagine as a private bedroom living space area. The key feature that makes this type of development unique is that the kitchen facilities are shared with others in the building. So that opens the opportunity for a more social living arrangement. The state did outline some intent behind this bill, where they mentioned it's intended to be a means to address the need for additional affordable housing options. And they even mentioned that newly constructed market rate co-living housing in the region could be affordable to people with incomes as low as 50% of the area median income, which is what AMI stands for on that slide there. Now that we have a better idea of what co-living is, we can kind of look closer at the legislative background of the bill. House Bill 1998 was passed back in 2024, and it's a new law that requires cities to allow for co-living housing. The bill mentions that co-living housing is intended to be naturally affordable. It does not rely on public funding sources. This is also due to the trade-off that people can choose to make for private space for the chance to live in a high opportunity neighborhood that's usually close to transit, and they might not have otherwise been able to afford. The bill also points out that co-living provides options for a range of different people, including but certainly not limited to anyone who wishes to lower their housing expenses by paying less for a smaller home, for people who prefer a living arrangement with shared community spaces that facilitate social connections, and anyone who is looking for a low-cost, more private alternative than having a roommate in a traditional rental would be. So we are responding, the City of Bellevue is responding to this state mandate, and we'll be updating the land use code to comply with the minimum requirements, and emphasizing that the state compliance deadline for us to make those necessary updates is the end of this year. Getting into where we must allow for co-living housing, we have a map here showing where generally co-living must be permitted in Bellevue. This map is included as part of a one-pager document that also goes over some of the baseline requirements that are set up in the bill. We will include a link to that one-pager. It's on the project webpage, but if you wanted to pull it up and zoom into the map and get closer to it on your own, you totally could do that. So co-living is allowed to be required where 6 or more multifamily residential units are allowed. In the dark purple there, we have existing mixed use and multifamily land use districts where 6 units were already allowed, and thus co-living must also be allowed. And then in the light purple color, we have outlined a quarter-mile buffer from major transit stops, countywide and regional growth centers, where 6 units are permitted as part of the middle housing code changes that were adopted earlier this year in June. So the light purple buffer on this map is also not 100% exact, since it is based on walking distance to the transit stop, countywide or regional growth center. So that would have to be evaluated on a lot by lot basis if it came down to it. But essentially we are required to allow for co-living in both the dark purple and the light purple areas. The distinction is that the dark purple is permitted outright and the light purple is based on that walking distance. And another thing, since there is some kind of overlap between all these new types of housing and middle housing, we want to clarify that co-living housing is not one of the 9 types of middle housing. The real only connection to middle housing is where 6 units are allowed, and thus where co-living must be allowed as well. Another thing to note is that co-living is not allowed when 6 units are only possible with an affordable housing bonus. So in cases where a lot is allowed to have 4 units outright, and the only way to get to 6 units is by providing 2 affordable units, co-living would not be allowed in those circumstances. You also notice that parking is on this map. I'm going to come back to that, I promise, in a later slide, but first I kind of wanted to go over some of the baseline requirements that are in the bill. These all surround development standards. The first being we cannot set dimensional standards that are more restrictive than those required by the state building code. So for things like minimum size of a room, that would be regulated by the building code rather than having standards in the land use code. We also cannot impose stricter development standards that would be required for other multifamily residential development in the same district. And then we can't require co-living to provide a set mix of unit sizes or include uses within the development like commercial. Some other regulations that were included in the bill for purposes of calculating dwelling unit density, a sleeping unit in a co-living development cannot be counted as more than 1/4 of a dwelling unit. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the sleeping unit is that private living and sleeping space that we saw on the first what is co-living slide. So that means one dwelling unit would be equal to 4 sleeping units. And then if you were looking at a lot where 6 dwelling units maximum are permitted on that lot, there is a maximum of 24 possible sleeping units. They don't have to do all 24, but there is that maximum cap based on the dwelling unit density ratio. Another requirement is that any review, notice, or public meeting process for co-living must be the same as other residential projects. We can't require anything extra for this type of development. We're also required to allow for co-living to participate in affordable housing incentive programs. And I wanted to mention that since the intent of this bill is to increase the supply of housing for low-income households, we intend to prohibit co-living housing from being used as short-term rentals. And then finally, on this slide, when it comes to calculating sewer connection fees, the fees per sleeping unit may not be greater than 50% of those required for a standard dwelling unit. I promised that we would come back to parking, and here we are with the map again. So there, in the bill, no off-street parking is required within a half-mile walking distance of major transit stops. So this includes light rail, bus rapid transit stops, and bus stops that run every 15 minutes during peak hours. Where no parking is required is represented on this map here with the black crosshatch. Again, you may want to pull up that one-pager document and zoom in since it seems like majority of it is that crosshatch. You can see there are some areas where parking can be required. So in those areas outside of the transit buffer, the maximum parking that we can require is 1/4 of a parking space per sleeping unit. So that calculates out to 1 off-street parking space per 4 sleeping units. And that brings us to the schedule. We are currently in this information and awareness phase of the project. It started in September with the launch of the webpage, which has more background information and some key parts of the bill. And we're, hosting this lunch and learn session that will also be available for viewing on the webpage to prep us for council initiation, which is coming up on November 12th. And then we're also set to go to council for our public hearing and action and adoption on December 2nd to get us in compliance with the state deadline by the end of the year. So now I think we'll open it up for Q&A that have been coming in through the chat. And then I'm also going to leave this up for anyone if you want to use that link to get to the project webpage. You can type that in, or you could use the QR code. And then that's my contact information. I think we can also put into the chat my email and my phone number if you wanted to ever reach out with questions or comments.
Great. So I'm going to turn this portion over to Christina Gallant, the Code and Policy Planning Manager. She'll be pulling out some of the questions that have been submitted over chat. As a reminder, we are using the chat for questions. So please provide any questions that you have so that we can address that during this portion of the meeting. Also want to remind folks that the chat is not a place for comments on the specific project. Instead, you'll want to message comments to Charlie or to City Council, since the City Council will be processing this code amendment. And the contact information for Council and for Charlie can be found in the chat, and I'll drop that in again just so you all have that. So Christina, how about we turn it to you for some of the questions we've been getting?
Thank you, Nick. First question, Charlie. When measuring by walking distance, so this is a question about the geographic scope of where co-living is allowed. When measuring by walking distance, what percentage of a lot must be within the prescribed walking distance to be permitted? For example, does the lot just have to be reached by walking distance, or does the entire lot need to be within the watershed?
And, I would want to probably confirm with land use. I'm not sure, Nick, if you know, but I would assume it's the entire lot.
So I can help there. Historically, our practice with these types of measurements is that the radius just has to touch the lot. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be within the entire watershed. All right. Next question. This person is concerned about potential for illegal conversions. So they have said, how will the city ensure that property owners are following city ordinances and health and safety laws and preventing illegally chopping up existing units into co-living housing? Or will that be possible?
Yeah, and I think that one kind of ties into our code compliance department. If there was something that seemed like an illegal conversion, a citizen could certainly make a complaint and have our code compliance come out and ensure that, if there is a co-living conversion, that was done properly through the right channels with the right permits and that kind of thing, and that they're conforming to the right, building code standards for safety.
Great. And I would just add to reinforce Charlie's point there that there's a permit threshold. And so if there is a permit required for this conversion, that is going to be important that someone applies for that. If someone is observing kind of this activity and has a question about whether or not this was legally permitted, those are questions that our department would love to field. We have code enforcement that specifically investigates those types of complaints and makes determinations in coordination with our department on whether or not a permit's required and whether or not there is in fact a violation.
And I think the other thing to note with that is that when talking to our building department, for converting something like a single family home into co-living, I think at a minimum, a change of use permit would be required. So that would be tracked as well.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, have we looked at how other cities are implementing this? And have we been seeing any differences so far?
Yes, part of, managing the project is researching what other jurisdictions are doing. We've seen it, Seattle's been doing this for a while, and so we've seen kind of how their approach has been. And then I think other jurisdictions, since we are coming up on that state deadline, they're starting to, go to their city councils and with their proposals to comply with the code. And so that's kind of all still developing around us as well.
Okay, next question. Do co-living arrangements need to provide a common area for food preparation?
That would fall back on what the building code requirements are. I think, just for a baseline, any type of dwelling unit, some type of food preparation area is required. So yes, the exact specifics would lie in the project proposal and exactly what those building code requirements are.
How does the co-living regulation affect single-family homes that may be shared among multiple families?
Um, well, the exact state minimum requirements for co-living, where it says, the individual rented lockable sleeping rooms with a shared kitchen, that is not currently existing with all of the requirements in our land use code. Everything from what I've seen has been much more restrictive than what the bill would require. So if there is existing, it would need to uh, meet the minimum requirements that are set forth in the bill and that come with this code update.
Right. Um, let's see. Next question, can co-living units be sold for home ownership or are they only for rentals?
Right now, as the bill has it, it specifically says individually rented and lockable. And so since it says rented in the bill and we're sticking to that baseline requirement, that's what we will propose as well. So no ownership.
Gotta unmute. Will covenants be required to document which sites are utilizing co-housing? Or will there be some documentation to establish that the density is related to co-housing and not traditional multifamily housing?
Yeah, the documentation would be during the permit process if you were to, build new co-housing developments or convert existing with that change of use permit. So that would be documented just like any other modification or change to specifically call out co-living housing so that that section of code applies to the development. And then, am I missing another half of that question?
No, I don't think so. I think they're getting at like basically could a developer propose co-living to kind of build more where basically as a loophole to build more, I think is what they're getting at. So what we're saying is that no, you have to submit a permit. And if there's a violation of the permit, there's a separate process for dealing with that. Yeah. Great. Okay, next question. Are bathrooms included in the sleeping unit or are they shared?
Yeah, that one isn't explicitly laid out in the bill. I think it's kind of dependent on what the building code would require then.
And this is related to a previous question about uh, previous question, but kind of just to reinforce, are single-family home conversions expected to meet the fire codes for multi-unit buildings?
Yes, any building fire life safety requirements that we would normally require, because co-living will be subject to as well.
Great. And I know we're aware that, one of the challenges single family conversions might face is that I believe sprinklers are required for co-living, right, Charlie? Yeah. So that's one of the pieces where we know these aren't going to be able to go in just anywhere. Okay. Next question. And I think this will be a clarification. What's the rationale behind a higher sewer connection fee? Aside from the unrelated residents within the dwelling, are these dwellings still at a typical house size or zoning? So kind of two questions. One would be a little more information on the sewer connection fees. And then I think also like, while we have this regulation around number of sleeping units, how does that relate to our development standards that apply for like how big the building can be, how tall?
Charlie, I might just jump in, just because the state is the one that had set the rule around the sewer connection fee, and capping that at 50%. And so we are proposing just to follow that mandate. We can't charge more than what the state will allow us to charge. Likely the rationale, not to put my head in or not to get in the head of our legislators, but I assume some of that relates likely to feasibility, and wanting to make sure that there was some that these projects could still be feasible and not have to be maybe cited a higher connection fee charge is probably what the rationale was. Um, and then these units are still going to have to apply or comply with all of our dimensional standards. And so these are all within areas that we allow for single family development today and middle housing now under the new middle housing code changes. So within those areas, they're limited to, a 35-foot tall building height, the FAR, the floor area ratio that would otherwise apply to that district. They're also limited to the setbacks and everything else that's in play in tree code. There's no kind of off ramp for co-living in terms of having to meet all of our development standards. And then where we allow co-living in our mixed use areas, so some of our shopping centers, downtown, crossroads, those areas, that's also where co-living is allowed, and the dimensional standards applicable within those areas would also have to apply to co-living housing types.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
So next we have two questions I think I'll group together. So, how can co-living be used as adult family home housing, like in a healthcare setting, or for group homes?
So for those specifically, there are state requirements for how to regulate an adult family home, right? And so those kind of bump it into their own unit. And I would say that no, co-living would not be counted as an adult family home, even though they are like similar with the social, kitchen and those kinds of arrangements, since there are very specific requirements for what constitutes an adult family home, we don't think that it would be co-living.
Okay. And then next question, this is a follow-up. So someone's asking, how do we measure if this is already occurring within extended families? So the difference between kind of co-living as a newly developed use versus people in an extended family just living together in a home by mutual agreement. And I can kind of clarify that one. So basically, co-living is a new kind of newly built or newly renovated use where you have kind of this purpose-built structure kind of driving the development for individual rentals. But if you have a large home that you want to share with roommates, that's a private agreement that we have certain regulations that are applicable to, but that would not be co-living in a sense. That's just a private arrangement. I don't know if Nick or Charlie, you have anything else to add there from the past work on family size regulations?
No, I think that covers it well. Co-living is a specific kind of purpose-built use, as Christina mentioned, but we are aware and we know my sister is one of these people, has roommates. That's a natural kind of thing for folks, and so that's different than what we're describing with this code change. That's really getting at a very specific housing type that people develop just as a course of business.
Thank you. And right now we're currently at the end of our questions. We have had some comments. Here's one question coming up. How does co-living deal with individuals who choose to co-buy? So individuals buying a home together?
Yeah, and this relates to the question earlier around, are these restricted to just rentals or can there potentially be an ownership option? And the city does not actually have a role in how projects are condoized. And so that is something where I'm not aware. It sounds like Charlie is not quite aware either of the pathway to have these as owned separately, since they are just sleeping units. They don't contain all of the elements that a home, a dwelling unit would contain. They don't have to have a kitchen within the unit. They share that. likely they'll have a bathroom in each unit, but it's unclear whether that's in fact a requirement. That's really probably driven by a developer and also, of course, our building code. So if there is a pathway for these to have condos, that would not be something that the city would directly deal with. I'm just not aware of the pathway for that. Also not aware of the market for that, but it would be interesting to know if that's what other communities are doing, and might be a little project for Charlie and I to look into as well. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And this same person had a follow-up on co-ops, which I'd say it's kind of the same answer, but this is, yeah, some really interesting cases for us to think about as we get into the application. And while we're waiting to see if any additional questions come in, we have received some comments, which we're appreciative, but we would just ask if you'd like to submit a comment for the project, please email those to Charlie. Her information is here, or directly to council. We would request that. Okay, getting some questions. Great, spurring it. Okay, next question. Can existing buildings be retrofitted as properties are renovated within aging buildings? Wonder how that kind of conversion could work.
I think in the same that we might anticipate seeing conversion of existing single family, with any other type of building, it would just have to go through those minimum building code requirements for conversion, and then similar a change of use permit to go from the existing use to co-living.
And next up, what is the incentive for developers to build co-living instead of, say, single-family housing or even traditional multifamily units?
Well, I can't really speak on behalf of all developers or what their incentive might be, but it seems that it would be like a more cost-effective type of development, since they are smaller and you can get more units to build.
Yeah. And we also know that there are different markets, right? And there are also different developers that specialize in different products. And so this might not be the option that your traditional single family home builder is going to take up. But this is an opportunity that maybe someone that's more in the co-living space, that has mostly done work in Seattle, is now seeing there's more land available to develop that type of housing unit within Bellevue, in those certain geographies. And so it's not necessarily there's an incentive, it's just the code is trying to provide more housing choices, more options within our areas that we already allow 6 units. And so it's likely, again, if the developer has experience with this product type and they have land within one of these geographies, that for them, that kind of opens the pathway. I would be surprised, but would be interested to learn if there are just single family home builders that are going to kind of convert and jump into this sort of category of housing. Um, that's just not something that we've heard reported from some of the folks in the development community, though.
Next up, do we know how this may be expected to affect projected population growth for Bellevue as a whole?
Exact numbers? I don't think so.
Yeah, what we do know is our targets, right? And so we are planning for 35,000 new housing units over the next planning horizon. So that takes us to 2044. We also know that a lot of our growth corridor is taking on that housing growth, but we have our residential areas, our neighborhood areas, outside of the growth corridor that also have a share of the growth that we are anticipating. It's hard. This is an untested product in Bellevue, so it's really hard for us to kind of speculate or model what might the market demand be for this and what might be the production over the next few years. Middle housing is a good example where, Bellevue has had less experience with that in our single family areas. And to date, or I just checked this week, we've had 3 applications for middle housing units since the code was adopted and went into effect July 1st of this summer. And so it takes time for people to get familiar with the code, if you've got to have an interest in redeveloping in this manner. You have to ensure that there's a market for it. Lenders don't typically lend money without you demonstrating that you're going to be able to pay back that money. And so some of that has to deal with how strong is the market for this. And those things I think are just untested right now in Bellevue.
Next up, how would the city review how street parking is enforced?
Well, we
So
would
we're
review off-street parking, but not on-street parking.
Yep, and we're not changing our on-street parking policies, so there is still the parking management piece that will not change as part of this code update. But as Charlie noted, we do have requirements for off-street parking, and so they have to provide those on the lot. But then parking that happens on the street is managed in the same manner that we manage on-street parking today.
And this is a kind of a quick clarification, which I remember I've got a quick answer to this one, so I think I'll take it on. Had someone asking if they thought the map might have some no parking areas indicated in places not close to major transit. So yes, we can check that. But another thing to keep in mind is our approach to policies like this, where there's a walking distance applicable, the applicant has to demonstrate when they come in with their permit that they have that walking distance to transit. So even if we do have some inaccuracies on the map, which we will check into, that is not what that map is not the regulatory tool saying, they still have to do their homework when they come in with their permit. But
Christina, can I add one more thing? Because this is something that we had discovered through the process of putting together this co-living housing package. The definition for major transit differs from the definition that was used in middle housing, which is really unfortunate that the state has handed us 2 definitions that mean 2 different things depending on the legislation. And so the definition for major transit in terms of where 6 units is allowed is defined in House Bill 1110, and that means generally light rail stations and the rapid ride stations. It's really limited to those 2 kind of transit stations. House Bill 1998, which has major transit defined, and it means where no parking is required, defines it more broadly. So it not only includes the 2 kind of transit lines that I just described for 1110, light rail and rapid ride, but it also adds a 3rd transit category, and that's the routes that have 15-minute headways. So during the PM peak hours. So as long as they're having stops every 15 minutes, that expands the area where no parking is required. That doesn't necessarily increase where co-living is allowed, though, but it does where it intersects with where 1110, House Bill 1110, the Middle Housing Bill allows for co-living. It will also kind of define where no parking is also the rule in those cases. So hopefully that was clear. I'm also happy to chat about this offline, or Charlie can kind of provide some of that definitional difference, but it's frustrating for us, it's confusing for us, and confusing for you all. But that's why there's that discrepancy as well.
Great. Yeah, that's a great clarification. Okay, next up. Where was I? Will these be counted to affordable housing targets in ways that ADUs are not?
So since we must allow them to participate in those affordable housing incentive programs, I would think that they would, if ADUs are exempt, they would contribute more in that sense.
Yeah.
But they're,
And
oh.
Well, the I think the commenter too, we have a specific provision that says ADUs shall not be counted towards affordable housing, for the purposes of kind of measuring our affordable housing production. And the slight kind of nuance to that is when those ADUs are not income restricted. And so just because something might land on the market at an affordable price, which it's arguable whether ADUs can do that, but co-living, you probably have a better chance that it'll land on the market at a more affordable rate. If it's not income restricted, doesn't have a covenant that says that it is affordable and it's required to be affordable, and people that are living there have to qualify based on income, then it will not count towards affordable housing or our affordable housing targets. So we're only tracking the items that have income restriction, or income restricted units, just to be clear. Though we do think this is an opportunity to provide more affordable options in Bellevue. And as Charlie noted, they'll have an option to do affordable housing incentives, but otherwise it won't show up as affordable housing if it's not income restricted.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Next question is, will co-living developments be able to turn their front yards into parking? So kind of concerned about, will there be that happening illegally? How do impervious surface lot coverage requirements play into this?
Yeah, and so those covered it a little bit earlier, those dimensional requirements that would apply for other multifamily in the same district apply to co-living as well. So it's not like there's an exception for co-living for lot coverage or impervious surface or anything like that. It has to follow the same regulations.
And there aren't any changes with co-living that would specifically, we wouldn't treat this differently than another home that's like illegally storing cars in their front yard, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
Yeah. So we had a couple questions on engagement. And I'll kind of group these together. Since we've shared that our approach with this project, since we're staying close to the state minimum, is to more on getting the word out. So first, how are we sharing information broadly to avoid groups getting left behind from learning about this? And then also, given that the deadline is coming up so quickly, how have we worked to equitably engage with historically underserved communities that will be affected, referencing the policy CE4 of our comp plan?
I think that to get the word out about the website launching, this Lunch and Learn, and other developments, we, with our PIO, identified a few very broad groups within the city of Bellevue that may have an interest in housing and affordable housing neighborhoods, and use those email lists to get this information out to try to capture a broad audience.
Thank you, Charlie. And next up, we have a question on, will there be any differences in how co-living units are tracked for like regional growth population tracking? If we know at this point, I have a feeling we might not know, but Charlie, wanted to pass that to you.
That is not 100% figured out yet because we're still figuring out if we want to add co-living as a new info field on our permit applications for tracking purposes. There's a bit of complication and nuance behind adding those. So we will see as it comes to as we finish this project along.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, more things for us to think about as we move forward. And we did have another question just to reiterate, we are not proposing any additional changes that would go above and beyond the minimum requirements of the bill. Okay. So no more questions at the moment. I think we might be at a pause. So Charlie, I'd pass it back to you, Charlie and Nick.
Can I make one more
Sure.
more plug? So hello, everybody. This is Brooke. I want to just reiterate that because the scope is limited to just the implementing the state requirements and not considering anything above or beyond them, that the engagement is more focused on informing people that this is happening and what is required, and comments, because the staff itself isn't going to be making any recommendations beyond the minimum to council, that then any comments that you want to make or suggestions or requests are going to go through the legislative process. And so look for that. And then I don't see it on here, but I also want to give a plug. I don't know if I can try to get the link and put it in the chat. But November 17th, we will be doing our first ever sort of development services town hall, which will be another opportunity to get just kind of a general overview of the many projects this department is working on currently and some of the upcoming work for the first part of 2026. So we want to make sure that people have a broader kind of picture of kind of what's coming up in terms of the work plan. And we encourage folks who want to kind of stay abreast of all the different sort of work around land use and code and policy to attend that event. And on November 17th, again, that's going to be more of an informational event, but really great as you kind of think about how you want to engage in the future on these kinds of projects.
Thanks, Brooke. And so with that, I think we can end a little bit early. And last kind of chance to scan the QR code or follow the link so you can take a look at the project details. You'll also find a link to Charlie's contact information. And as Brooke noted, this is something that will be headed to council on November 12th to discuss. We'll be asking at that study session that the council initiate the code amendment so that we can meet our deadline of December 31st. And the same night, we're asking that they provide any input and direct us to schedule the public hearing, which would then be scheduled for December 2nd. And we would expect council action on December 2nd because the deadline again is December 31st. That's the state mandate that we're following in terms of the timeline. And there are limited meetings between now and the end of the year, given holidays, given that we are in the mid-biennium budget update process. We are competing for time. And so that's really the schedule that you can expect for this code change. Any questions you have, please do reach out to Charlie. And we really appreciate everyone taking the time today to learn about co-living housing. So thanks all.